Maria's hair fell like silk through her trembling fingers. She had sold everything else first: jewelry, clothes, dignity. But this was the last piece of herself that felt like hers. The wig-maker's shop smelled of chemicals and stranger's vanity, and she wondered if her son would even recognize her when she came home shorn and empty. Outside, Phoenix heat shimmered like a cruel mirage, promising nothing. The man who bought her hair that day didn't know he was purchasing back the ghost of his own abandonment. Maria Delgado was about to feed her son with the price of her beauty, unaware that the buyer held the key to 8 years of silence. Subscribe to witness what happens when the past meets the present at the sharpest edge of sacrifice. Maria Delgado sat in the worn leather chair of the wigmaker's shop, her hands folded in her lap like a prayer she'd forgotten how to finish. The mirror before her reflected a woman who looked older than 42. Though her hair, thick, chestnut brown, flowing past her shoulders, still held the youthful shine of someone who'd once believed in happy endings. She had washed it 3 times the night before, conditioned it with the last of the expensive treatment she'd been saving, because even in desperation she wanted to offer something worthy. The shop was small, cluttered with mannequin heads wearing wigs of every color and texture, their blank faces watching her like a jury of silent witnesses. The air was thick with the scent of adhesive and synthetic fibers, a sweetness that made her stomach turn, though she couldn't tell if it was the smell or the knowledge of what she was about to do. She had called ahead, asked the price per inch, calculated how much her hair was worth against the cost of groceries, rent, and the small sneakers Leo needed for school because his toes were pressing against the fronts of the old ones, and she couldn't bear the thought of him walking in pain. The wig maker, a woman named Susan with kind eyes and weathered hands, had explained the process with clinical gentleness, the way a nurse might describe a necessary procedure. "We'll braid it first, cut it close to the scalp, and then you'll sign the release form. The buyer is very particular. He only wants natural, undamaged hair. You're lucky. Yours is perfect." Maria had nodded, though the word lucky felt obscene in her mouth. There was nothing lucky about being a single mother in Phoenix, Arizona, working 2 jobs that still didn't cover the bills. About watching your child's eyes dim a little more each time you told him dinner would be smaller tonight, that new toys weren't in the budget, that maybe next year things would be different. She had tried everything else first, sold her grandmother's necklace, pawned her wedding ring from a marriage that had dissolved like sugar in rain, applied for assistance programs that told her she made just slightly too much to qualify, as if poverty had a precise threshold that she danced above by mere dollars. The hair had been her last asset, the final thing of value she possessed, and now even that would be stripped away. Susan's fingers were gentle as they sectioned Maria's hair into thick braids, the tugging sensation familiar yet strange, as though someone was preparing her for a ritual she didn't fully understand. "You have a beautiful child," Susan said softly, glancing at the photo Maria had placed on the counter. Leo, age 8, grinning with a gap-toothed smile that still held innocence despite everything. Maria's throat tightened, and she forced herself to breathe through her nose, to keep the tears at bay, because crying would only make this harder, and she'd promised herself she would be strong. "He's my whole world," she whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. Susan squeezed her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between women who understood what it meant to give pieces of yourself away for love. The scissors appeared then, long and silver, catching the fluorescent light like a blade at an execution, and Maria closed her eyes because she couldn't watch herself disappear inch by inch, couldn't witness the transformation from the woman she'd been to, the woman necessity was forcing her to become. The first cut was swift, almost painless, a whisper of metal through fiber. Maria felt the weight lift from her head immediately, the sudden lightness both liberating and terrifying, as though she'd severed not just hair, but some essential part of her identity. Susan worked quickly, efficiently, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this countless times, and Maria wondered how many other women had sat in this chair, surrendering their beauty for survival, their stories folded into the braids, now wrapped in tissue paper and placed in a bag marked with a buyer's name she couldn't see. When it was done, Maria opened her eyes and stared at the stranger in the mirror. A woman with short, uneven hair that exposed the vulnerable curve of her neck, the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the exhaustion she'd been hiding behind cascading waves. She looked stripped, raw, like a secret that had been exposed to harsh light. Susan handed her an envelope thick with cash, more money than Maria had held in months, and the weight of it felt both like salvation and damnation. A reminder that everything in her life now had a price, even the things she'd once thought were hers alone. Outside, the Phoenix sun was merciless, beating down on the pavement with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and distort, turning the world into something unreal. Maria clutched the envelope against her chest and walked toward the bus stop, her head feeling strangely cold, exposed, as if she'd removed armor she hadn't known she was wearing. She thought about Leo waiting at her neighbor's apartment, probably doing homework or watching cartoons, unaware that his mother had just sold a part of herself so he could eat, so he could have new shoes, so he could keep believing that the world was a place where he was safe and loved. The guilt was a physical thing, heavy in her stomach, mixing with relief and shame in equal measure. She had always told herself she would do anything for her son, but she hadn't imagined anything would mean this, sitting in a chair and letting herself be dismantled piece by piece. As the bus pulled up, belching exhaust into the already polluted air, Maria climbed aboard and found a seat by the window, pressing her forehead against the warm glass and allowing herself finally to cry. The money would last a month, maybe 6 weeks if she was careful, if she bought the store brands and skipped meals when Leo wasn't looking, if she walked to work instead of taking the bus and ignored the blisters forming on her heels. But after that, she didn't know what she would sell next. There was nothing left but her body, her time, her blood. And even those, she knew, had limits. The bus rumbled through the streets of Phoenix, past strip malls and apartment complexes that all looked the same, past playgrounds where children laughed and swung without knowing how fragile their joy was, how quickly it could be taken away. Maria watched them through the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass, and wondered if Leo would grow up to understand why she'd done the things she'd done, or if he would only remember the absences, the apologies, the look of defeat in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. The envelope crinkled in her lap, the sound of it almost accusatory, and she pressed her hand over it as if to silence its judgment. This was love, she told herself. This was what mothers did. They gave and gave until there was nothing left but the hollow space where they used to be. Mr. Richard Sterling stood in his downtown Phoenix office, 52 floors above the city, looking out at a view that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. The glass was floor-to-ceiling, bulletproof, tinted to keep out the harshest rays of the desert sun. And through it he could see the sprawl of civilization pushing against the mountains in the distance, a testament to human ambition and stubbornness. He was 45 years old, though most people thought he looked younger. Money had a way of erasing time, smoothing wrinkles, keeping the body fit and the skin tight through personal trainers and dermatologists, and a life insulated from the kind of stress that aged regular people. His suit was custom-tailored, Italian, the kind of fabric that whispered rather than spoke, and his watch was worth more than a modest car. He had built his empire from strategic investments, ruthless negotiations, and a willingness to walk away from anything that didn't serve his interests, including, 8 years ago, a relationship that had become inconvenient when a pregnancy test came back positive and threatened to complicate his carefully constructed life. The call from the wig maker had come that morning, alerting him that a new acquisition was ready for his review. Sterling collected rare and natural materials as a hobby: exotic woods, precious stones, human hair that would be used in the custom wigs his wife wore for charity galas and society functions. He didn't think much about where the hair came from, didn't concern himself with the stories attached to the women who sold it, because to do so would be to acknowledge a humanity he'd trained himself not to see. Business required distance, a separation between the self and the consequences of one's choices, and Sterling had mastered that separation so thoroughly that he barely remembered the man he'd been before wealth had calcified around his heart like armor. He told his assistant to have the hair delivered to his office, along with any documentation the seller had provided, because he liked to inspect his acquisitions personally, to feel the quality between his fingers, to ensure that what he paid for was worth the price. The package arrived in the early afternoon, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine, the simplicity of it almost quaint in the marble and steel environment of his office. Sterling dismissed his assistant with a wave of his hand and opened the package alone, pulling out the braids of chestnut hair that gleamed even under the artificial light. It was beautiful, thick, healthy, the kind of hair that spoke of good genes and careful maintenance, and he ran his fingers through it with the detached appreciation of someone evaluating merchandise. There was a form attached, the seller's information printed in neat block letters: Maria Delgado, age 42, Phoenix resident. He barely glanced at it, his attention still on the hair, until something made him pause. A small photograph that had been paper-clipped to the form, probably by accident, the wigmaker's oversight in an otherwise professional transaction. The photo showed a woman and a boy, both smiling, and Sterling's hand froze mid-motion as his eyes locked onto the child's face. The boy was 8 years old, maybe 9, with dark hair and a smile that was still forming, baby teeth giving way to adult ones in that awkward stage of childhood. But it wasn't the smile that stopped Sterling's breath in his chest. It was the eyes. They were his eyes, the same unusual shade of grey-green that he saw in the mirror every morning, the genetic marker that had been passed down through his family for generations, so distinctive that there could be no mistake. Sterling felt his pulse quicken, a sensation he rarely experienced, his carefully controlled world suddenly tilting as connections formed in his mind with sickening clarity. Maria Delgado. The name hadn't registered at first, buried under 8 years of deliberate forgetting, but now it rose like a ghost from the past. Maria, the woman he'd dated briefly, casually, the one who'd called him crying to say she was pregnant, and he'd responded by changing his number, blocking her emails, erasing her from his life with the efficiency of someone deleting a file. He'd convinced himself it wasn't his problem, that she'd probably been lying or mistaken, that he had no obligation to a child he'd never wanted and a woman he'd never loved. But here, in his hands, was evidence he couldn't deny. The boy in the photograph had his eyes, his nose, the shape of his jaw already beginning to mirror Sterling's own. The woman beside him, Maria, looked worn, tired, older than Sterling remembered. But there was a fierceness in the way she held the child, a protective stance that spoke of years of solitary struggle. Sterling sank into his leather chair, the braids of hair still clutched in one hand, the photograph in the other, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something crack in the foundation of the life he'd built. Guilt. It came slowly at first, a trickle, then a flood, overwhelming him with images he'd refused to imagine. A woman raising a child alone, working until her hands bled, selling her hair to feed a son whose father had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had done this. His abandonment, his cowardice, his refusal to acknowledge responsibility had led to this moment. To a woman sitting in a chair and letting herself be cut apart because he'd walked away. Sterling stood abruptly, pacing the length of his office like a caged animal, his mind racing through possibilities and justifications and the crushing weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. He could find her, offer money, try to undo the damage with the only tool he understood: wealth. But even as the thought formed, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Money couldn't buy back 8 years of missed birthdays, of first words and first steps, of nights when the boy, Leo, the name on the form said Leo, had probably asked where his father was and received an answer that broke his mother's heart to give. Sterling had built an empire by knowing the value of everything, but he'd never calculated the cost of absence, the price of a child growing up, wondering why he wasn't wanted. The photograph trembled in his hand, and he realized with a start that his eyes were wet, that something long dormant inside him was waking up and screaming in protest at what he'd become. He had to fix this. He didn't know how, didn't know if it was even possible. But he couldn't unsee what he'd seen, couldn't unknow what he now knew. His son was out there, living a life Sterling had denied him, and the woman who'd raised him alone had just sold her hair to keep him fed. Maria pushed open the door to her small apartment, the envelope of cash hidden deep in her purse, as if its presence might burn through the fabric if anyone saw it. The apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms in a complex where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, and the plumbing groaned like an old man waking up. But it was clean, filled with the small touches that marked it as a home. Leo's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a worn sofa covered with a blanket to hide the tears in the upholstery, plants on the windowsill that Maria watered religiously because they were the only living things, besides her son, that depended on her and didn't ask for more than she could give. Leo was at the kitchen table, hunched over a math worksheet, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration, the way it always did when he was thinking hard. He looked up when she entered, and his face lit up with the kind of pure joy that made every sacrifice worth it, every moment of pain justified by the simple fact of his existence. "Mom, you're back!" He scrambled out of his chair and ran to her, wrapping his thin arms around her waist in a hug that squeezed the breath from her lungs. Maria held him tight, pressing her face into his hair that was the same shade as hers had been before she cut it, a genetic inheritance that now felt like a cruel joke. "I missed you," she whispered, and it was true, even though she'd only been gone a few hours. Every moment away from him felt like a small death, a reminder that time was finite and childhood was fleeting, and she was missing pieces of it because she had to work, had to hustle, had to keep them afloat in a world that didn't care if they drowned. Leo pulled back, his eyes widening as he noticed her hair. "Mom, what happened? Your hair is so short." There was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity, and Maria forced herself to smile. "I wanted a change," she lied, ruffling his hair to deflect attention. "Do you like it?" Leo tilted his head, studying her the way he studied everything, with an intensity that was both endearing and heartbreaking. "Yeah," he said finally. "You look pretty. You always look pretty." The words were a knife to her heart, so innocent and sincere that she had to turn away to hide the tears threatening to spill. She busied herself in the kitchen, pulling groceries from the bag she'd brought, real groceries, not the cheap substitutes she usually bought, but fresh fruit and vegetables and a chicken she planned to roast for dinner, a feast by their standards. Leo followed her, chattering about his day at school, about the spelling test he'd aced and the game of kickball at recess, where he'd scored the winning point. Maria listened with half an ear, nodding and making encouraging sounds, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of the wigmaker's shop, of the cold blade against her scalp, of the stranger in the mirror who'd stared back at her with hollow eyes. She wondered what the buyer would do with her hair, if he would even think about the woman who'd grown it, if her sacrifice would register as anything more than a transaction in a ledger. The thought made her angry. A sudden flare of rage that she quickly tamped down because anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. And Leo was watching her with those perceptive eyes that saw too much for a child his age. The knock on the door came just as she was pulling the chicken from the oven, the skin golden and crackling, filling the apartment with a smell that made Leo's eyes go wide with anticipation. Maria frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she walked to the door, her body automatically placing itself between the entrance and her son, because years of living on the edge had taught her to be cautious. She looked through the peephole and saw a man standing in the hallway, tall and well-dressed, his face partially obscured but somehow familiar in a way that made her stomach twist with unease. She opened the door a crack, the chain still engaged, and said, "Can I help you?" The man turned fully toward her, and Maria felt the world tilt as recognition slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Richard Sterling. The man who'd abandoned her when she told him she was pregnant, who'd erased her from his life as if she'd never existed, who'd condemned her to 8 years of struggle and solitude with his silence. Maria. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, smooth, educated, the kind of voice that could convince you to believe anything if you weren't careful. But there was something new in it now, a tremor of emotion she'd never heard before, and it made her grip the door tighter. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous because Leo was just a few feet away and she didn't want him to hear, didn't want him to be part of this collision between past and present. Sterling held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, and she noticed they were shaking. "I saw the photo, the one that came with your hair. I know about Leo. I know he's my son." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable, and Maria felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. She'd spent 8 years telling herself she didn't need him, that she and Leo were fine without him, that his absence was a blessing rather than a curse. But now, standing face to face with the man who'd shaped her son's features and then walked away, she felt the full weight of her anger and grief come crashing down. "You have no right to be here," she hissed, her knuckles white where they gripped the door. "You have no right to claim him after all this time. I told you I was pregnant and you ran. You didn't want to know, didn't want to help, didn't even want to acknowledge that he existed. And now, what? You see a picture and suddenly you care? You think you can just show up and everything will be fine?" Sterling flinched as if she'd struck him, and Maria felt a savage satisfaction in his pain. He deserved this. He deserved every ounce of anger she'd been carrying for 8 years. Every night she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering how she'd pay the bills. Every time Leo had asked about his father, and she'd had to lie and say he was gone, but it wasn't his fault, that some people just couldn't be parents. "I know," Sterling said quietly, and the brokenness in his voice almost made her falter. "I know I have no right. I know I failed you both. But I'm here now, Maria. I want to help. I want to be part of his life if you'll let me. I know I can't undo the past, but maybe I can do something about the future." Maria stared at him, this man who'd once been her entire world for a brief, foolish moment, who'd promised her nothing and delivered exactly that. She wanted to slam the door in his face, to protect Leo from the disappointment she was certain would come when Sterling inevitably abandoned them again. But she could also see the genuine anguish in his eyes, the guilt that seemed to be eating him alive, and she thought about the envelope of cash in her purse, the food in her kitchen, the shoes Leo needed that she could now afford to buy. She thought about the years ahead, the struggles that wouldn't end just because she'd sold her hair, and she realized with a sickening clarity that she was too tired to turn down help, even from the man who'd destroyed her. "Not for me," she said finally, her voice cold and hard as stone. "If you want to be in his life, it's not for me. I don't forgive you, and I don't want your money to fix what you broke in me, but Leo deserves to know his father, if you're willing to actually be one. Not a checkbook, not a visitor who shows up when it's convenient, a father." Sterling nodded, relief and terror warring on his face, and Maria opened the door fully, letting the ghost of her past step into her present, praying she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. Leo stood in the kitchen doorway, his eyes darting between his mother and the stranger in their apartment with a confusion that made Maria's heart ache. She could see the questions forming on his face, the uncertainty about who this man was and why her mother looked so tense, her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Sterling, for his part, seemed frozen, his gaze locked on the boy with an intensity that bordered on desperate, as if he was trying to memorize every detail, to make up for 8 years of absence in a single moment. Maria took a breath, steadying herself, and walked to Leo, placing her hands on his shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and grounding. "Leo, this is Mr. Sterling. He's someone I used to know. He'd like to talk to us for a little while, if that's okay with you." Leo looked up at her, searching her face for cues about how to respond, and she forced herself to smile, to project a calm she didn't feel. "It's okay, baby. I'm right here." Leo nodded slowly, then turned his attention to Sterling, and the man seemed to wilt under his son's scrutiny, as if the weight of that innocent gaze was more than he could bear. Sterling knelt down, bringing himself to Leo's eye level, and Maria's breath caught at the sight of them together, father and son, mirror images separated by years and choices and an ocean of regret. "Hi, Leo," Sterling said, his voice soft and uncertain, so different from the confident businessman who'd walked through her door moments ago. "Your mom is right. I knew her a long time ago before you were born. I made some mistakes, big ones, and I'm here because I want to try to make things right, if that's possible." Leo's brow furrowed in the way it did when he was processing complicated information, trying to fit new pieces into the puzzle of his understanding. "What kind of mistakes?" he asked, his voice small and curious, and Maria felt her throat tighten because children were so direct, so unfiltered, asking the questions adults learn to avoid. Sterling glanced at Maria, seeking permission or guidance, and she gave him none, her expression unreadable. This was his moment, his chance to either step up or fail, and she wouldn't make it easier for him. "The kind where I wasn't there when I should have been," Sterling said carefully, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "The kind where I let fear and selfishness stop me from knowing someone really important, someone like you." Leo tilted his head, studying Sterling with that unnervingly perceptive gaze. "Are you my dad?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating, and Maria felt the room contract around them, all the air sucked out by the weight of that single inquiry. Sterling's face crumpled, and he nodded, a jerky movement that seemed to take all his strength. "Yes, I'm your father, and I know that doesn't mean much right now because I haven't been here, but I'd like to change that, if you and your mom will let me." Leo was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Maria wanted to pull him away, to shield him from the potential hurt that was sure to come when Sterling inevitably disappeared again. But before she could move, Leo spoke. "Mom says my dad had to go away, that it wasn't my fault. She says some people just can't be parents. Is that what happened to you?" The innocence of the question, the lack of accusation in Leo's voice, seemed to break something in Sterling. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking, and Maria watched dispassionately as the man who'd once held all the power in their relationship fell apart in front of his son. "Yes," Sterling choked out, his voice muffled. "I couldn't be a parent. I was scared and I ran, and I've regretted it every day since, even when I tried to pretend I didn't. I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry." Leo looked at Maria, his eyes wide and uncertain, and she saw the question there. Should I forgive him? Should I let him in? Maria didn't know the answer. She didn't know if Sterling's guilt was enough, if his money could ever compensate for the years he'd stolen, if a man could change so fundamentally that he became someone worth trusting. But she also saw the longing in her son's face, the deep-seated need every child has to be wanted by both parents, and she realized, with a heavy heart, that this decision wasn't hers alone to make. "Why don't you sit down, Mr. Sterling?" she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Dinner is ready. You can stay, and we can talk." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even close, but it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain. The first step on a path she couldn't see the end of. Sterling stood slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and nodded, following her to the small kitchen table, where 3 plates were already set out. A coincidence that felt almost prophetic. Maria served the chicken, the vegetables, the simple meal that had seemed like a feast just moments ago, and now felt inadequate in the presence of this man who probably ate at 5-star restaurants every night. But Sterling didn't seem to notice. He ate with the focus of someone performing a sacred ritual, pausing occasionally to glance at Leo, who chatted about school and friends and his favorite video game with the resilience of a child who hadn't yet learned to hold grudges. Maria watched them both, her heart a tangle of emotions she couldn't name, and wondered if this was hope she was feeling, or just exhaustion disguised as something softer. After dinner, Sterling helped clear the dishes, his movements awkward in the small space, and Maria found herself standing shoulder to shoulder with him at the sink, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked in silence. "I meant what I said," Sterling murmured, his voice low enough that Leo, absorbed in a book at the table, wouldn't hear. "I want to be here. I want to know him, and I want to help you, Maria. Not to buy your forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. Because I should have done it 8 years ago and I didn't, and I can't take that back, but I can start now." Maria didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary, her hands red from the hot water. Finally, she set the plate in the rack and turned to face him, her eyes hard. "If you hurt him, if you let him down the way you let me down, I will make sure you regret it. I don't care how much money you have or how powerful you think you are. He's my son first, and I will protect him from anyone who tries to break his heart. Even you. Especially you." Sterling held her gaze, unflinching, and nodded. "I understand, and I'll prove it to you, Maria. I'll prove I can be the father he deserves." Maria wanted to believe him. Some small, wounded part of her that had loved him once, that had dreamed of a different ending to their story, wanted desperately to believe that people could change, that redemption was possible, that the man standing in her kitchen was capable of the transformation he promised. But she'd been disappointed too many times, had carried the weight of his absence for too long to trust easily. So she simply turned back to the dishes and said, "We'll see." And in that moment, as Phoenix darkness fell outside the window and Leo's laughter echoed through the small apartment, the 3 of them existed in a space between past and future, bound by blood and mistakes and the faintest, most fragile thread of possibility. Maria's hair was gone, sold to feed her son, but in its place was something unexpected, not hope, not yet, but the willingness to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the years ahead might be different from the years behind. And for now, In the exhaustion and uncertainty of her 42 years, that was enough.